Hello, Joy Horner here. There's been a few changes since I last did a YouTube video, but here we are. I've got new specs, new reading specs, which I'm having to wear more and more often. A few more grey hairs, a shorter haircut, which is absolutely brilliant. And I'm still learning. I'm constantly learning. And this time last week, I was told something by one of my prenatal group, which I'd been blissfully unaware of. It appears that my birth story of my first and second child are in a book by Ina May Gaskin. Now, I'm sure I must have sent her my birth story years ago. She must have put out a request for birth stories. Or perhaps I just wrote to her to let her know why I wanted to give birth on the farm, it was one of my big fantasies when I was pregnant. Perhaps I could just go to the farm and, everything would be brilliant. But yeah, she's actually published it in one of her books. And one of my class said, "Oh yeah, I know about your birth story. It's in Ina May Gaskin's book." And I said, "No, it's not. I've got Ina May Gaskin's books. I've got all of them except the breastfeeding one." And she said, "No, it's on Audible. I've got it on Audible." So I listened on Audible. It's free if you're a member of Audible at the moment. And it's this book, Ina May's Guide to Childbirth. So I got Audible, and yeah, my birth story is there, which is lovely. Absolutely brilliant. I'm going to write to Ina May and thank her so much, for including my story, because I never gave birth on the farm, but it is a very important story, as all birth stories are. But in the context of me being a former midwife and now a birth keeper who's made it my life's work to help people who've suffered through difficult times, through traumas, and still getting used to these glasses. They keep slipping down when I'm talking. People that have suffered birth trauma, that have suffered abuse in childhood, that have suffered in relationships or with sexual abuse, has become a very, very big part of the work that I do. So yeah, it is a really important story in the context of what I do, and I'm telling it in the hope that it might help other people, because birth for me wasn't plain sailing. And it's really interesting to see my words, because I must have sent them a long time ago. I was still a midwife at the time. It's just so interesting. So I'm going to read it for you. So those that have got the new version, it isn't in the old book, but the new, completely revised and updated, I'm on page 130. So this chapter's called A Midwife's Own Journey of Healing by Joy Horner, Independent Midwife, UK. My first birth gifted me with the ability to care for others, and in doing so, to truly heal myself. As a second child, I was born quickly and easily, at 42 weeks of pregnancy, in the presence of midwives. My younger sister was born at 44 weeks of pregnancy and weighed 11.5 pounds. Childbirth, according to my mother, was easy, like shucking peas, and she didn't know what all the fuss was about. During my medicalised midwifery training, I actually wondered why women were having such a hard time of birthing. This was in England in 1988, and active management of labour was being practised in the attempt to make childbirth shorter and therefore better for women. Well, that's what we were taught. I hated interfering unnecessarily in normal labours and left 18 months after qualifying, figuring out that I wasn't cut out to be a midwife. 2 years later, at the age of 29, I became pregnant. I found a copy of Spiritual Midwifery in my local bookshop, and I couldn't believe how happy everyone looked in the photos. Why didn't my own midwifery training teach me that childbirth could be enjoyable? Even the midwives looked like they were having a good time. Amazing. With my faith in birth restored, I thoroughly enjoyed my pregnancy and planned for an intervention-free birth at home. I ate well, exercised, and considered myself to be fairly tough, having some of my mother's genes. So how hard could it be? Labour started spontaneously one evening at nearly 42 weeks of pregnancy. Contractions started every 5 minutes and were pretty intense throughout that night. A midwife checked me at 6 a.m. and I was 2 centimetres dilated. She returned at midday when I was finding it really hard to cope, and my cervix was somewhere between 4 and 5 centimetres. A further check at 4 p.m. found my cervix was still at 4 to 5 centimetres, and I knew something was really wrong as the pain was really intense. My contractions were very frequent and strong, so they should have been effective. I swiftly rejected an offer to have my waters broken to speed up labour. I'd seen enough induced labours to know that the pain would increase, and I was already struggling despite using Entonox, a mixture of nitrous oxide and oxygen. I decided I needed to transfer to hospital for an epidural, as this didn't seem to be a normal labour pain, and with an epidural on board, I could once more be coherent in my decision-making. Despite the reciting of my epidural twice, it wasn't effective, leaving me numb, with immobile legs, but feeling every single contraction. My waters were broken and an oxytocin drip started. I really don't remember much more about that evening, as the pain became unbearable. I was crying and begging the staff to help me. I had a growing sense that my baby was stuck and that we were both going to die. It was a busy night on the labour ward, and midwifery care was sparse. At midnight I was 9 centimetres, but my baby was found to be a brow presenting, so I was prepped for a caesarean. There were a couple more hours of agony before a theatre was free. A couple of hours fearing that my baby would die and wishing that I could die also, so the pain would stop. The anaesthetist wanted to do a spinal block, but I begged for a general anaesthetic, just so the misery would end. I grabbed his lapel and told him not to let me die under anaesthetic. I awoke to my husband's voice telling me we had a daughter and how beautiful she was. I'd been given morphine, so there was no more pain, just a blurry outline of a baby suckling at my breast. I was in recovery, and the student midwife was with me, monitoring my recovery. Suddenly, my daughter and my husband disappeared, and the room filled with people. I was hemorrhaging, and I was rushed back into surgery. I awoke 12 hours later with a blood transfusion in progress. I'd lost a lot of blood, but they managed to stop the bleeding without further surgery. The pain after surgery was nothing compared to labour pain, and I was just grateful that we were both alive, so I got on with mothering. I recovered well physically, but I suffered 9 months of postnatal depression. I just got on with caring for my daughter, and I didn't think about the birth much at all. I think it was my way of coping. When I did think about the birth, I blamed myself. Maybe I'd caused the brow presentation. Perhaps I shouldn't have gone to the hospital. The intrusive thoughts that my body had failed to do what a woman's body is designed to do, to give birth, caused me to relive the day that I nearly died, with every birthday my daughter celebrated for years after. I learned not to give details of my story, for fear of scaring those yet to become parents, but I know now that telling the story would have helped. A couple of years later, I pleaded with my husband to let me have a second child. He too had been traumatised by the birth and said that he didn't want to risk losing me again. 3 years after my daughter was born, I became pregnant with my second child, and my fears of birth resurfaced. I got the notes of my previous surgery and read how the surgeon had had difficulty disimpacting my baby's head from my pelvis. This really helped me validate how difficult her birth had been for the both of us. I hadn't been a wimp. It had been as awful as I thought it was. As a midwife, I knew that a brow presentation was rare and unlikely to happen a second time. I needed to try for a vaginal birth, knowing it would be my only opportunity to know what it felt like to push a baby out without assistance. I knew that I'd only have 2 children. So I planned for both a vaginal and a repeat caesarean birth. At 42 weeks, I had a quick, perfect and very healing VBAC. I knew my body had worked as it was meant to. I didn't suffer postnatal depression. I returned to midwifery when my youngest was 5, and at first had trouble even walking into an operating theatre as it triggered flashbacks. Luckily, I worked in a birth centre and now as an independent midwife, so we don't see caesarean birth very often. As independent midwives, we're not often allowed into theatre with our clients, but occasionally a kind midwife sneaks me in, knowing that I can help my clients remain calm. Occasionally my birth trauma has been re-triggered, showing me that there's still healing to be done, even many years after my daughter's birth. Each time, the memory of what it felt like to have no more choice and a real fear of death. Flashbacks which last only seconds. Helps me to make the experience as good as it can be for the women that I care for. One woman's baby was impacted in her pelvis and the obstetrician struggled to free it for many minutes. For weeks afterwards, I helped validate her experience as she worked through her pain and grief. Helping her recover helped me heal some more too. Another woman had to have an unplanned caesarean under general anaesthetic. Again, I was allowed into theatre and could do all the things that I wished had been done for me. A mother's need to care for and nurture her baby doesn't cease if she's unconscious. She will need to know what happened to her baby while she was unable to care for him. Who held him, if he was welcomed into the world lovingly and gently, that he was spoken to and reassured that all was well, and that his mama was longing to meet him, and that he would soon feel her embrace. I'm now able to do this for my clients, so they have no gaps in their baby's life story or their own. And then Ina May goes on to talk about active management of labour, so I'll read that bit so you get the whole thing, although it's not part of my story. Active management of labour became widespread in England, in the English-speaking world, in the 1980s by its chief proponent, Irish obstetrician Kieran O'Driscoll, master of a large maternity hospital in Dublin. The method was based on his opinion that birth would be improved if it happened earlier and faster than the old school of watchful waiting could produce. It featured intentional rupture of the water bag and acceleration of contractions by oxytocin drip if labour wasn't already moving at the desired rate of 1 centimetre an hour. O'Driscoll claimed his method would produce a low caesarean rate and healthier babies. When I was in Ireland, this is Ina May, I met many mothers who told me otherwise, including one whose 4th baby died in Dr. O'Driscoll's care because her uterus ruptured from an overdose of IV oxytocin. No labour there was to exceed 12 hours. but each of her previous labours with her living children did. In some places, O'Driscoll's influence is still felt. See page 239 in Dr. Wolfe's essay. But research has shown that most women's labours take longer than the time limits that O'Driscoll recommended. See Induction of Labour in chapter 6, page 241. How about that? How about that? I'd forgotten that it was such a painful and difficult experience for me. I've done so much work in the 30 years since that first birth that it's now categorised in a place of my head as one of very great importance, but I don't feel it has the trauma attached to it. I've explored many methods of healing over the years, healing myself, and also training in different modalities so that I can help others. I offer the Rewind 3-step technique. I offer a birth story witnessing, listening service. I offer a service to forensically search through people's notes to find out what happened and why. Quite often in an emergency, people are left wondering what happened, why they happened as they did. We can put all this together to help things make sense. So I'll leave it there for today, because you know me, I could talk for a very long time. But I hope this is useful, and please get in contact if I can help you in any way.